Imagine a world where calling your neighbor a name gave him the legal right to end your life. Yet stealing a kiss resulted in immediate banishment. The Vikings weren't just wild raiders. They were a society obsessed with hyper-specific, often hilarious legal codes. Today, we are uncovering 50 of the most absurd, nonsensical laws the Norsemen ever created. From fashion policing to mandatory duels, prepare for a side of history that is far stranger than any Hollywood movie. 1. Calling another man a coward or implying he was unmanly was practically a death sentence. In Norse law, using the specific word arger to insult a man's masculinity gave him the absolute legal right to kill you on the spot without facing any murder charges. The Vikings took their reputation so seriously that words literally justified lethal force, making verbal arguments incredibly high stakes. Think about that the next time you leave a nasty comment online. Would you still type it if the recipient was legally allowed to sail over and swing an axe at you? 2. Grabbing another man's beard during a tavern brawl was an incredibly expensive mistake. Beards were the ultimate symbol of Norse masculinity, and touching one aggressively was heavily penalized under the law. Depending on the specific region, pulling a man's beard cost you a massive fine in silver, payable directly to the offended party. If you pulled it hard enough to actually rip out the hair, the fine skyrocketed into financial ruin. It was basically a strict hands-off policy enforced by the constant threat of total bankruptcy. 3. Stealing a kiss from a woman was punished almost as harshly as stealing a Viking longship. If a man kissed a woman without her consent, or even with her consent but without her family's explicit approval, the legal penalty was sudden and brutal exile. Romance in the Viking Age was an absolute legal minefield, where one misplaced moment of passion could result in you living in the woods as a hunted fugitive. Modern dating is tough, but at least a bad date does not end with you being banished to the frozen wilderness. 4. Writing a love poem to a woman without permission could literally get you banished from society forever. You might think the fierce Norsemen would appreciate a softer side, but unauthorized romantic poetry was considered a severe legal offense. Poetry was viewed as a form of magic that could manipulate a woman's emotions, directly insulting her male relatives. If you composed verses praising a woman, you could be declared an outlaw, meaning anyone could hunt you down and kill you. Rhyming eyes with skies was simply not worth dying for. 5. You were totally allowed to keep a massive brown bear as a house pet, but you were strictly liable for all of its property damage. Vikings loved exotic pets, and importing bears was a massive status symbol. However, the law explicitly stated that if your domestic bear wandered off and destroyed your neighbor's property or mauled their livestock, you had to pay full compensation. How would you like to explain to your landlord that your emotional support bear just casually ate the neighbor's prized flock of sheep? 6. If you really liked your neighbor's farm, you could legally take it by simply challenging him to a formal duel. This was called a holmgang, a legally recognized way to settle disputes. If challenged, you legally had to accept, or you were deemed an outcast. The duel's winner took whatever was agreed upon beforehand, which could literally be the loser's entire estate. Professional duelists eventually abused this absurd loophole, traveling from town to town to challenge rich guys and legally rob them blind before the law was finally changed. 7. Throwing a bone across the feasting hall and accidentally hitting someone in the head carried a specific, legally mandated fine. Viking parties were aggressively rowdy, with heavy drinking and massive feasts of roasted meats. Because people were constantly hurling the leftover animal bones across the room for fun, lawmakers had to literally put a standardized price tag on the collateral damage from flying ribs. If your leftover dinner gave a guy a concussion, you had to open your coin purse and pay up right there on the spot. 8. Medical diagnostics were written directly into the legal code, specifically regarding severe stomach wounds. If a warrior was stabbed in the gut, the healer would feed him a strong broth made of onions and leeks. After a few minutes, the healer would smell the wound. If they could smell onions leaking out, the law dictated the wound was legally fatal. At that point, the doctor was legally permitted to stop all treatment. Primitive? Yes, but you have to admit it is a brutally efficient way to triage patients. 9. Wearing a shirt with a plunging neckline was grounds for an immediate, no-questions-asked divorce. Norse women actually had surprising legal rights, including the ability to divorce their husbands with relative ease. One legally recognized reason for a woman to demand a divorce was if her husband wore shirts cut so low that his chest was exposed, which was considered exclusively female attire. Fashion policing was literally a cornerstone of Norse marital law. Do you think modern marriages would last longer if bad wardrobe choices were legally actionable? 10. Sending someone to Valhalla in broad daylight and immediately bragging about it made you a surprisingly upstanding citizen. Norse law loved honesty. If you won a fatal altercation in public, left your weapon, and immediately told 3 people, you simply paid a fine and walked away. But doing the exact same deed secretly in the dark to hide the evidence, that was considered an unforgivable, cowardly act, carrying the ultimate penalty. Radical transparency was basically a legal loophole. 11. For centuries, chewing on a roasted horse was a completely normal Tuesday night dinner for a Viking. But the moment Christianity became the official law of the land, consuming horse meat was suddenly reclassified as an unforgivable pagan ritual. If you were caught sneaking a bite of your favorite equine snack, the authorities could strip you of all your property and banish you from the country forever. Imagine getting permanently deported just because you could not give up your favorite exotic jerky. 12. If you had a beef with your neighbor, you couldn't just start a rumor. But if you composed a mocking song known as a nidvisure that insulted his honor, you were committing a massive crime. The law treated a diss track with the same severity as a physical assault. If the song was catchy enough to actually damage his reputation, the poet could be outlawed and banished to the wilderness. Imagine getting legally deported just because your mixtape was too fire. 13. The Vikings loved a good argument at their local democratic assemblies, known as the Thing. But because these debates frequently escalated into intense physical altercations, lawmakers invented mandatory peace strings. Before entering the voting area, every man was legally required to tie his sword into its scabbard using complicated knots. If you got mad and tried to draw your weapon, you would look absolutely ridiculous fumbling with the strings for 5 minutes, giving everyone else enough time to calm you down. It was essentially a mandatory, legally enforced timeout. 14. A Viking man might have ruled the battlefield, but the woman of the house held absolute, legally binding power over the pantry. By law, the household keys hung from the wife's belt, symbolizing her total authority over the estate's resources. If a husband dared to snatch those keys from her without permission, it was considered a massive legal overstep. The wife had the immediate right to divorce him, keep her dowry, and take a massive chunk of his wealth. Never underestimate the power of a woman with the keys to the snack cabinet. 15. What happens when your house is haunted, but you also happen to be a deeply litigious Norseman? You take the ghosts to court, obviously. According to historical sagas, if restless spirits were causing a disturbance and ruining your sleep, you could legally assemble a jury at your front door and formally sue the ghosts for trespassing. You would present evidence, issue a legal verdict, and officially order the ghost to vacate the premises. The craziest part is that, according to the records, this bizarre legal eviction actually worked. 16. Stumbling upon a washed-up whale was like winning the medieval lottery, but it immediately triggered an insanely complicated legal nightmare. Norse law had entire chapters dedicated to the exact mathematical division of whale blubber. The man who found it got a cut, the man who owned the beach got a cut, and the king automatically claimed a massive percentage for doing absolutely nothing. If you accidentally took the wrong piece of the carcass, you could face devastating fines. Imagine getting audited over a giant sea mammal. 17. Chopping down a tree in someone else's forest seems like a standard medieval crime, but the Viking legal system made it wildly specific. If you illegally chopped down an apple tree or an oak tree, the fine was astronomical because those trees produced valuable food. But if you chopped down a standard pine tree, the fine was significantly cheaper. lawmakers had a literal sliding scale of financial ruin based entirely on the botanical species of the wood you decided to steal in the middle of the night. 18. Messing with a man's longship was one of the fastest ways to guarantee your own funeral. Ships were the absolute lifeblood of Norse society. If you secretly shaved down a wooden plank on someone's boat, just enough to make it leak when they sailed out to sea, it was legally classified as the highest form of treason and cowardice. You would be permanently stripped of your honor, labeled an outcast, and hunted down by the community. Would you ever trust a mechanic again if the penalty for a bad repair was total exile? 19. Brawling was practically a national sport, but there were strict rules of engagement. If you were losing a fist fight and decided to bite your opponent, you crossed a major legal line. Biting was viewed as the behavior of a wild animal, not a respectable free man. If you left bite marks on another person during a scuffle, you were heavily fined and publicly shamed for acting like a rabid dog. You could break a man's arm and society would just shrug, but using your teeth made you an instant pariah. 20. Paying your annual taxes is always painful, but for the Norsemen living in the Greenland settlements, the currency was utterly bizarre. The King of Norway demanded his royal tribute, but since silver was incredibly rare in the frozen north, the law allowed citizens to pay their official taxes using walrus skulls and tusks. The royal treasury literally had massive storage rooms filled to the brim with giant sea mammal teeth. Honestly, handing the tax collector a giant tusk sounds a lot cooler than writing a check. 21. Imagine getting legally sued by your own sword. Norse mythology is absolutely obsessed with sentient weapons that had personalities, names, and, apparently, a strict moral code. While they were not literal court cases, the sagas are filled with instances where a sword would simply refuse to be drawn from its scabbard if the intended fight was unjust or dishonorable. It was considered a divine judgment, a supernatural legal injunction against stupid violence. Imagine your own gun jamming because it disagreed with your life choices. 22. Going berserk eventually became illegal. We all know the stories of berserkers, the frenzied warriors who chewed on shields and fought without armor. But by 1015 AD, Norway actually outlawed these warriors. The Jarls realized that having guys who uncontrollably flew into a murderous rage was bad for a stable society. If you were caught going berserk, or hanging out with a known group of berserkers, you could be banished. It's the historical equivalent of banning the rowdiest fraternity on campus. 23. Running away from a battle was the ultimate disgrace, but doing it while carrying a shield made it even worse. The law had a specific term for dropping your shield to run faster, skjaldmøy, which roughly translates to shield shucker. If you were labeled this, you lost all legal standing in society. You could be beaten, robbed, or even killed without any legal repercussions because you had proven yourself unworthy of protection. The lesson was simple: hold the line or lose your life. 24. Viking laws regarding inheritance were surprisingly progressive, but also hilariously specific about illegitimate children. If a man had a child with a thrall or a concubine, the child could still inherit property, but only if the father formally acknowledged them in a public ceremony involving a specific type of ale. If he refused to drink the ale and declare the child his, the kid got absolutely nothing. So, your entire financial future depended on whether your dad was thirsty enough to handle a public toast. 25. If you were a blacksmith, you were basically a wizard in the eyes of the law. Because forging iron was seen as a magical process, blacksmiths were often exempt from certain community duties, but they also faced unique legal restrictions. If a sword broke in battle due to poor craftsmanship, the blacksmith could be held liable for the warrior's death and forced to pay a massive fine to the family. It was the original product liability lawsuit, but instead of a recall, you just went bankrupt. 26. Accusing a woman of witchcraft was a dangerous game. While we associate witch trials with later centuries, Norse law had strict rules about false accusations. If you accused a woman of using magic to harm your cattle or curse your family, and you could not prove it with solid evidence or witnesses, you were the one who got punished. The penalty for slander was severe, often involving heavy fines or even temporary exile. So, unless you saw her flying on a broomstick, keep your mouth shut. 27. Vikings loved their falcons, and the law reflected that obsession. Training a hunting bird was a massive investment of time and resources, so stealing or killing someone's trained falcon was treated as a major property crime. The fine for killing a trained hawk was often higher than the fine for killing a thrall. It shows you exactly where the priorities of the wealthy Norse elite lay. A bird that could catch dinner was simply worth more than a human being who could only cook it. 28. If you were a guest in someone's home, you had a legal right to hospitality, but you also had a legal obligation to leave. The law stated that a guest could stay for 3 nights without question. On the 4th morning, however, the host was legally allowed to kick you out or demand payment. This rule prevented freeloaders from overstaying their welcome and draining the host's resources. It is honestly a rule we should bring back for modern house guests. 3 days, then get out. 29. Norse law had a very specific way to deal with arson. If you burned down someone's house while they were inside, it was considered a uniquely heinous crime called husbruna. Unlike regular murder, which could be settled with a fine, arsonists were often declared outlaws on the spot. This meant anyone could kill them without penalty. The logic was that fire was an uncontrollable force, and using it as a weapon showed a complete disregard for the safety of the entire community. 30. Let's talk about the legal status of cats. Yes, cats? Freya, the goddess of love and war, rode a chariot pulled by 2 giant cats, making felines sacred animals. Killing a cat without a very good reason was considered bad luck and potentially illegal depending on the local customs. While not strictly written into every law code, harming a cat was seen as an affront to the gods themselves. So, the internet's obsession with cats might actually have ancient divine roots. 31. Domestic violence laws were surprisingly strict regarding the husband's behavior. If a Viking man slapped his wife in public, it wasn't just a marital spat. It was a legal catastrophe for him. The first slap was a fine. The second slap was a bigger fine. But if he slapped her a 3rd time, she had the immediate legal right to divorce him, take her entire dowry, and leave him financially crippled. Ladies, would you tolerate a partner who leaves his socks on the floor if the law let you take his house for it? 32. Stealing from someone was considered infinitely worse than robbing them at sword point. Viking law made a massive moral distinction between ran, open robbery, and stoled, theft. If you mugged a guy on the road, you were a criminal, but at least you were honest about it. But if you snuck into his house and stole his cup while he wasn't looking, you were a needinger, a social pariah without honor. It is a weird legal system where the method of the crime matters more than the crime itself. 33. Long before rap battles filled stadiums, the Vikings had a legally recognized contest of insults called flighting. This wasn't just drunken bickering, it was a formal exchange of wits where 2 men insulted each other's courage, ancestors, and fashion sense in verse. The winner gained massive social status, while the loser was publicly humiliated. In some cases, a well-crafted insult during a flighting match could legally resolve a dispute without anyone having to draw a weapon. Imagine settling your parking ticket by roasting the judge in rhyme. 34. You could only move out of your house during 4 specific days in late May or early June, known as fardagar. If you wanted to relocate to a new farm or switch lords, you had to do it within this strict legal window. If you missed the deadline by even an hour, you were legally bound to stay in your current home and work for your current boss for another entire year. It brings a whole new level of anxiety to packing your boxes, doesn't it? 35. The legal code had a gruesome price list for every single body part. This system, called weregild, meant that if you cut off a man's nose in a fight, you owed a specific amount of silver. A thumb was worth more than a pinky, and a damaged eye had a premium price tag. It was basically a personal injury lawsuit, But instead of insurance companies arguing, you just weighed the silver and handed it over. It makes you wonder, how much do you think your left ear is worth in today's economy? 36. To make a marriage legally binding, you needed witnesses in the most awkward place imaginable, the bedroom. Under Norse law, a marriage wasn't fully ratified until the couple had been publicly escorted to bed by witnesses who saw them get under the covers together. This ensured that no one could later claim the marriage wasn't consummated or that the union was a sham. It was a necessary bureaucratic step, but it definitely killed the romantic mood. 37. If you ever wondered why Iceland had so few trees, blame the sheep and the law. Once the Vikings settled the island, they immediately realized wood was scarce, so they created incredibly strict laws regarding driftwood. If you found a piece of wood on the beach that had a distinct owner's mark, you were legally obligated to return it or face a massive fine. Stealing a log was basically the medieval equivalent of grand theft auto. Would you report your neighbor to the authorities over a piece of soggy timber? 38. If the court couldn't decide if you were guilty, they made you carry a piece of red-hot iron 9 paces. This was the trial by ordeal. After you carried the burning metal, your hands were bandaged. 3 days later, a priest would inspect them. If the wounds were healing cleanly, God had protected you, and you were innocent. If they were infected, you were guilty. It was a legal system based entirely on your immune system's ability to fight off a third-degree burn. 39. Cutting a free man's hair against his will was a crime that carried the same penalty as a severe physical assault. In Viking society, long hair was a symbol of freedom and status, while a cropped head was the mark of a slave. If you held a man down and cut his hair, you were legally stripping him of his identity and social standing. The court treated an unwanted haircut as a form of symbolic enslavement, proving that a bad hair day could literally ruin your life. 40. If you went bankrupt, you didn't just lose your credit score, you lost your freedom. Debt slavery was a very real legal consequence in the Viking Age. If a man could not pay his debts or the fines he owed for crimes, he could be forced to sell himself into temporary servitude to pay it off. His labor became the currency. It was a brutal system, but it certainly motivated people to pay their bills on time. Would you work harder if the penalty for late payments was becoming your bank manager's butler? 41. If you stumbled upon a deceased person while walking through the countryside, you couldn't just keep walking. Norse law dictated a strict 3-house rule. You were legally required to report the discovery to the very first house you passed. If you didn't, and then passed a second and a third house without saying anything, you could be charged with the person's passing yourself. It was a brutal way to ensure that no one could hide a crime by pretending they never saw the body. Essentially, the law made every citizen a mandatory first responder, whether they liked it or not. 42. Viking divorce laws were remarkably pragmatic, especially regarding life in the bedroom. If a husband was unable to satisfy his wife due to impotency, she had absolute legal grounds to end the marriage immediately. However, she could not just leave a note. She had to publicly announce her reason at the local assembly, making her husband's private failure a matter of public record. This allowed her to reclaim her full dowry and move on to a more capable partner. While incredibly embarrassing for the man, it ensured that women weren't legally trapped in unfulfilling or childless marriages. 43. Even the most fearsome warriors had to deal with strict parking regulations. The Liability system required coastal farmers to maintain warships for the king, but it also created complex rules for where these ships could be beached. If you parked your longship in a spot designated for someone else, or blocked the communal boat shed during the winter, you faced heavy financial penalties. It was essentially a medieval homeowners association, but with dragon-headed ships instead of lawn ornaments. Imagine the stress of coming home from a long raid only to find a legal summons stuck to your mast because you double-parked in the wrong fjord. 44. The legal penalty for slander was designed to be both physically painful and poetically ironic. If you were convicted of spreading malicious lies that destroyed a neighbor's reputation, the court could order your tongue to be cut out. Since a person's word was their most valuable asset in an era without written contracts, destroying someone's honor with a lie was seen as a capital offense. It was a literal interpretation of the phrase, "watch your mouth." This brutal deterrent ensured that if you were going to talk trash about someone, you'd better have the evidence to back it up. 45. Stealing milk from a neighbor's cow was not just a simple theft. It was often prosecuted as a form of dark magic. Folklore described Tilbury, strange creatures made from ribs and wool that witches supposedly used to suck cows dry. If a farmer noticed his livestock producing less milk, he might legally accuse a neighbor of sorcery. The law took these agricultural disputes so seriously that people could be executed for what we would now consider poor animal husbandry. It was a world where a sudden dip in dairy production could trigger a full-scale legal investigation into the supernatural. 46. If your dog decided to take a bite out of a passerby, the Viking legal system had a very specific way of handling it. For the first 2 times your dog attacked someone, you just had to pay a standard fine for the injuries. But if the dog bit someone for a 3rd time, the animal was legally declared an outlaw. This meant the dog lost all legal protection, and anyone had the right to kill it on sight without paying the owner a single penny. It was a medieval 3 strikes law, but instead of prison, it applied to your poorly behaved golden retriever. 47. Building a bridge wasn't just a matter of infrastructure, it was a way to buy your way out of legal or spiritual trouble. In some regions, a man could be granted legal leniency or even social prestige if he funded and built a sturdy bridge for the community. Inscriptions on runestones often brag about men building bridges for the sake of their souls. It was a clever way for the law to encourage public works without using tax money. If you committed a minor crime, you might find yourself hauling stones into a river just to get back into society's good graces. 48. Being declared an outlaw was a death sentence with extra steps, but the law recognized 2 distinct levels. Lesser outlawry involved a 3-year banishment after which you could reclaim your rights. However, full outlawry, known as skoganger, meant you were legally considered dead while still walking. Your property was confiscated, your marriage was annulled, and anyone could kill you without facing any legal consequences. You were a man of the woods, stripped of humanity and protection. It was the ultimate social erasure, proving that in the Viking world, the community was everything. 49. Buying a horse in the Viking Age was a legal gamble that came with a mandatory test drive period. The law stated that if you bought a horse and it turned out to have a hidden defect, like being blind in one eye or having a secret limp, you had a specific number of days to return it for a full refund. However, if you worked the horse too hard during that period and it died, you were stuck with the bill. It was one of the earliest versions of consumer protection laws, designed to stop sneaky traders from selling lemon horses to unsuspecting farmers. All right, we have looked at 49 of the most head-scratching rules from the Viking Age, and it is time to crown a winner. In our opinion, the prize for the most bizarre rule goes to the Smell the Onion medical test. It perfectly captures the Viking blend of total brutality and weirdly logical problem-solving. It's hard to beat a legal code that uses your breath to decide if you're worth saving. Do you agree with our pick, or did the low-cut shirt divorce take the cake for you? Let us know in the comments. And now for our final number. 50. The law required you to close a dead person's eyes immediately to prevent them from becoming a draugr, a supernaturally strong and murderous zombie. Vikings believed that if a corpse's eyes remained open, the spirit could see the living and return to haunt them. To prevent an undead rampage, the closest relative had to approach the body from behind to avoid being seen, and manually close the eyes and mouth. This wasn't just a tradition, it was a legal and spiritual necessity to keep the dead in their graves. In the Viking Age, your final legal duty was ensuring your relatives didn't come back to dinner as monsters. From beard-pulling fines to the legal power of a keyring, the Viking Age was governed by a system as brilliant as it was bizarre. It turns out even the fiercest raiders needed a massive book of rules to keep society from falling apart. If you lived back then, which of these laws would have definitely gotten you exiled within your first week? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this trip through history, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of the world's strangest facts.